Yeah, the washer's missing on this camera. I don't know that it ever had one. Unusual. An early type. Serial number starts 315. Didn't strike that with the other ones though. Well, this camera had certainly been serviced before. That was quite obvious from the state of the Leatherettes. Had 2 layers of adhesive on them. I've just mentioned it was missing a washer at the top of the camera on top of the film advance shaft. That was unexpected. But also, this is the rewind button. Now I don't know what that monstrous thing is there, but that was what was in place of the thick washer that forms part of the rewind button. That's a very odd looking thing. It looks like a washer and a sleeve. It certainly doesn't belong there, and all in all I'd say that very likely whoever that outfit was, or someone later, has made a mess of this camera. This delightful looking specimen of a shutter, it's got problems. The blades are wide open. Lens doesn't look like anything to write home about either. Let's have this apart. The camera of this one came off. Had a variety of problems. Some of them induced by repair methods used. We won't go into that at the moment. Let's just take this apart. Very, very stiff. That grease is very reluctant. The retaining ring still on the back. A few scrape marks on that rear group, so it's been out and in before. Yeah, just use the back of a butter knife to get that loose. And it's not giving up without a fight. Not sure why that should be so tight on the threads, but it is. That diaphragm looks distinctly greasy looking. Let's get this front, this middle element out. At least that one gave up without a fight. Okay, let's see what I've got. All the shutter blades have decided to close now. Let's have a look. Wrong one. As soon as I cock it, but it immediately opens. So it didn't stay cocked. Alright, an interesting one. So you can see it's missing its lock screw here, and so it's got 3 touches of lacquer being put on there to lock it in place. That's not my work, because I don't normally put them in those positions if I'm doing something like that. Normally I would put it in these notches, and probably 2 would be more than sufficient. I'll just give them a dab with a bit of acetone, I think. bit of an offensive shade of bright pink, that lacquer, whatever it happens to be. There's a lot of scratches on here, so someone's been poking at this with a screwdriver tips or something of that nature. It's quite tight. It's probably lacquer or dried grease got down in that thread. Okay, we can see how far that lacquer had spread. We're down to the shutter. Let's have a look at this. Well, the blades are quite greasy. You can also see there that they're quite marked. Well, those marks, some of them at least, are fingerprints. So, terrible things have happened to this shutter. Let's undo this main spring. Have a look at that. Well, it's very tired, but not the worst one I've ever seen. That alone wouldn't have caused these problems. The action of this main cam is quite stiff. What are the speed trains like? Do they move? That still moves. The self timer. Oh, that's very reluctant. Let's have those speed trains out. So, yet to discover what was causing the stiffness in the shutter, causing it to fail to cock or stay cocked. I think we've got an answer to that already. Okay, let's get the speed train out and its mate. Alright, this piece, this is the latch. It holds the main cam in the cocked position. Its return spring is here, and that should be hooked over the top of that arm, and instead it's jammed in underneath. Let's see if we can get that in the correct position. Oh, the spring's misshapen. It's probably not quite long enough to stay reliably. Okay, it's back in position now. Yeah, this thing here should have been sprung loaded, and that would serve to keep the main cam in the cocked position. When the main cam is cocked, this is its rest position. When it's cocked, it would be round here. You'd see this come around behind that latch. That's the action that was failing to happen, because this thing was not sprung loaded, because this spring is misshapen and it had fallen down underneath the arm. Okay, so that's the immediate cause for this thing to not function correctly, or the main cause. It's dirty and greasy. It's probably not worth putting it back together in this state to see what other faults it's got. We already know the self-timer won't go. Just continue stripping it down and cleaning it. Yeah, this particular camera has been repaired on at least one occasion previously, quite possibly more than that. Yeah, that spring there. It's very misshapen. I'm not sure how it would get into that state. And amongst its other problems, the rewind button was a bit of a puzzle, because it had this collar on the shaft and it was only held on by a couple of threads. And it turns out that the rewind button has come from a Retina 1A or 2A. It had nothing to do with this camera, so it was the wrong rewind button, and it also had the wrong washer on the rewind button too. Okay, so just checking this. That action is very stiff, almost gummy you'd say. Now it's not showing any liquid oil on those blades, but they do look greasy. But they are just really filthy. The diaphragm, what's that like? Well, we saw that it was, yeah, that's stiff. You can see that oily look there. It's quite stiff. When they get that stiff and you apply a bit of pressure on them, the blades start to flex, because you're pushing at one end of the blade and the other end doesn't want to go anywhere. Let's have that off anyway. Okay, shim off there, it's okay, just very dirty. This is our settings lever for the self timer. It's quite dirty looking, but it's probably, a lot of that darkness there is probably graphite grease, which probably didn't need to be there. I'll remove the B lever and its return spring. This spring here is the return spring for the self-timer lever. Here's our B lever, and there's its return spring. Now we can flip the shutter over and open it up. This camera had also suffered some abuse to the frame counter mechanism on the top cover, and the rewind. The camera had been dropped, the rewind was bent, so the screw was bent, and interestingly the disc underneath it was also bent. Yeah, that's really well out of shape. To find bits in my parts boxes. Okay, let's get those blades off. Those blades are uniformly filthy, but you can see they're not sticking together. It's the mechanism plate. Let's see how freely that moves. Yeah, it's not too bad. Okay, so here we have the case with the diaphragm in it. Yeah, that's doesn't want to move. Those blades are certainly stuck together. So the stiffness with the diaphragm, it was nothing to do with the setting lever. It's all to do with the state of those blades, and they are uniformly greasy looking. Yeah, look, they're stuck to that plate. They're stuck with grease. Alright, well, the case is a bit grimy looking. It's also damaged. We had another camera earlier where the camera had been dropped on its nose and the shutter case was deformed. Well, this side here is nice and flat. This side here is definitely risen up at that point, which means that the shutter's been pressed down at this side. The camera's been dropped on its nose at some stage. Well, given the other damage to the camera, that doesn't surprise me at all. So I will go down to the shed and stick this on a former and see if I can push that back out. Looking at the back of the case, yeah, I can even see that it's off square. That's probably a measurable distance there. I should get my calipers out and measure that really. I'll report back if I find anything interesting. This seems to have multiple problems. Film advance for a start. That's not a good look, is it? Tends to stick. And the shutter works sometimes, and other times you just get a click and that's all. So, have this one apart, see what we can do with it. I'll start by removing the shutter, I think, and we'll take that apart. See if I can get into the back of the camera. Back catch is a bit stiff. And of course we need the flash contact loose, so I'll just loosen that screw. Okay, so far so good. Let's take that. Let's have a quick look here. So there's a fair few shims here. Let's get those shims off. So we've got about at least 3 paper shims there and a metal shim. Rear lens group looks okay. Let's see if the shutter will cock and fire by itself, or whether it's a problem with the body and something with the cocking action there stopping this from cocking. Let's see how this behaves. That's fully cocked. Now, it certainly didn't want to release promptly. Yeah. It does go, but it's very reluctant to go. I suspect it's a bit gummed up in there. Alright, so for the shutter, certainly needs some work, certainly has problems. Let's have a look at the camera body. The film advance seems to be behaving better with the shutter missing. Well, it's still not 100% enthusiastic to return to the rest position. Let's have the shutter apart. Right. So remove the 3 screws. Or not remove, but loosen the 3 screws holding the focus scale ring in place. Put that to one side, unscrew the front element. That's not over stiff, that feels quite smooth in its action. Looking at the state of that, that's definitely old grease there. The name trim ring fell out. They were glued in place on some of these retinettes and just sitting in place in others. This one shows no sign of glue. The middle group here, or the middle element, let's have that out. That was not over tight. Spins out very easily. The rear one, let's have that out. That's quite tight on the threads. I don't know why that should be particularly. It's loosened up now. Nothing there to see, doesn't appear to have been locked in place with lacquer or anything. So from the front we have the screw here that locks the retaining ring. And I want a toothpick to turn that and push it around so I don't scratch things. That front ring is certainly not over tight. Came loose very easily. Let's find somewhere to put these pieces down. Nice clean front plate here. Graphite grease for the click stops. The shutter speed setting ring. We can lift off these two rings. This gives us our adjustments for the aperture settings here and the shutter speed settings there. These parts all look in very tidy condition. The speed settings cam plate. What can we see here? Well, one of the things we can see is there's a definite change in colour there. This is silvery grey stuff, graphite grease I would think. There's an orangey stripe there. I don't know what that is. It's certainly grease. And the shutter proper. Let's get this. We can take out the shutter release lever here. And start removing some of this overburden. Let's take that cocking shaft out. You're going to unhook the spring from the main cam. I'm interested to see how tired that looks. Very, very tired. See if we can lift that off. Yeah, so that spring there, if we take this as being your 12 o'clock position, that's a good 4 o'clock. That's a very tired spring. And that would be one of the contributors to the shutter failing to release correctly. It was probably cocking, but it didn't have enough impetus to overcome the reluctance of some of these parts to move. So we can remove the main cam. Let's take out the flash contact. There's a washer underneath that screw. You don't want to lose that. And the moving flash contact can come out. Leave this thing alone. That's riveted in, I think, from memory, and that is an eccentric. If you start playing with that, things won't work nicely. Take out the retard gear train. If I can pick it up, it's want to recover the screws from that. And the other one's still in the body. And the self-timer. These parts are all quite clean. There's a big fingerprint on the top there, and then that's common enough. Take out the screw here that holds the B lever in position. Of course that came flying out along with its spring. The spring acts on this pin here on the setting lever for the self-timer. The B lever can be lifted out. And here's the return spring for the B lever. Now I've just got to get that off the post without losing it. Nothing else needs to come off there. 3 screws hold the setting lever in place for the diaphragm. This is a later shutter, of course, so it has 5 diaphragm blades, not 10, as on the earlier shutters. Take the shim off, take the setting lever off for our self-timer. 3 screws here hold the mechanism plate and the case together. Lift off the case, and here we have our shutter split into 2. Let's check the diaphragm blades and see how easily they move or not. They move okay, a bit grimy looking, nothing too bad. We can remove the 3 screws that hold the retaining plate in place. Tip that lot out. Now the retaining plate, you can get the light to catch this correctly, or just right. There's oil visible here, here and here. It shows as a purplish tinge on the plate at that point. This is the moving plate that swings the blades in and out. Again, that looks quite oily. The diaphragm blades do not look particularly oily, and they look to be in good condition, so they should clean up well. Back to the mechanism plate now. Here's our shutter blades. They're all looking pretty good. There's a few marks on the surfaces there. There's certainly a mark there, and that's corrosion. There's a little pattern of corrosion on the blade at that point. It probably came in contact with moisture, I would think. Let's tip those blades out. Yep, there's certainly corrosion there, so that's going to have to be polished with a bit of Brasso to get rid of that, because corrosion like that, it forms a roughness on the blade, which means that it doesn't swing as freely as it should do. But the blades are not in terrible condition. If I hold this little lever here out with my finger so it's not interrupting the action of the blade actuating ring, I can swing this backwards and forwards and check how freely it moves. It's got a bit of a dry feeling to the motion. Look, it's not lubricated as well as it might be. You can see, I think you can see here, there's a bit of graphite grease about here, this silvery grey looking mess on the lever, and at this point and here it's sort of been applied with a broad brush, I think, instead of a precise amount precisely where it was needed. It's sort of been sploshed on in the general direction. Those 3 screws out of the lens tube. Take the lens tube off. That looks pretty good. There's not much evidence of lubricant on that of any sort. Normally you'd expect to see a bit of graphite or graphite grease around the inside of that. Here's the blade actuating ring. You can see the graphite grease applied here and here. There's a touch there. There's none really on the centre where it swings around the lens tube, and the mechanism plate itself, which again looks pretty devoid of anything in the way of lubricant there. This side, which faces the shutter blades, that looks quite clean. Not seeing any oil contamination there. That certainly just needs to be cleaned. It leaves us with a bit of a puzzle as to why the shutter was quite so reluctant to work. Certainly the way it behaved when it was cocked and then released, the mechanism, the blade actuating ring, was failing to move, which would normally you'd expect that this was perhaps a bit gummy, dried grease or something, or the blades were very stuck together with oil. Those would be the main things I'd be looking to find, and neither of those are really obviously present there. And that only leaves us with the mainspring here, which is tired, but I would expect a spring in that condition, had the shutter been cleaned and lubricated and everything running smoothly, even with a spring as tired as that, it should have behaved a bit better. So these components I'll just clean up, and then I'll reassemble it and we'll see how it behaves. Well, the shutter's back in the body, all serviced. No reluctance now, it fires every time, speeds are good, everything's looking great. So the shutter certainly needed to be serviced. Not really any smoking guns there, a few contributing factors. The main spring being very tired certainly didn't help, and there was just enough stiffness and gumminess in other parts to cause things to not happen as freely as they should. Anyway, that can come back off. I want to service the body next.